All right, so I've got my app here on College Board. This app, all it does is it's a blackjack app. So you press deal, and it deals out some cards. It says the dealer is showing queen, and your hand is 4 and 7, and that's a total of 11. And you can hit, and it will. Oh, I got 24, so I definitely lost, right? Next hand, blah blah blah. I've got 12. Hit, stay. Oh, I lost because the dealer got 19 and I got 19. Anyway, so whatever. This is what my app does. Let's look and see how this corresponds to the rubric. So the first thing that I would need to do is record my video. Okay. Here's what I would do in my video. You ready? I'd press run, then I'd press deal, and then I'd stop my video. That's all I need to do, right? Because my pressing deal is my input, and then you can see stuff happen on the screen. It took $10 away from me. It says what the dealer is showing. It says what my hand is, and it says what the total is. So I've got an input, which is me pressing the deal button, and an output, which is me, which is the dealer having a hand, me having a hand, and the total, and it taking away money, right? Okay, so in here, it says 3A, provide a written response that describes the overall purpose of the program. The purpose of my program is to play blackjack against a computer dealer and bet money on each hand. Okay? Describe what the functionality, or what functionality the video illustrates. Remember, all I did in my video was I pressed run and then I pressed deal, right? So the functionality that was shown there is to say, if you press the deal button, it generates a player hand with 2 cards and a dealer hand with 2 cards. These are separate lists. Okay, so it's saying what functionality that shows in the video. All right, describe what the input and output of the program is shown in the video. The input is clicking the deal button. The output is 2 lists that are being generated. One's the player hand and one is the dealer hand. It says that the player hand shows the total value and the dealer hand shows 1 card only. Right? Okay, let's look and see how this corresponds to the rubric. The first thing says, the video demonstrates the running of the program, including an input, program functionality, and output. Okay? So some functionality of the program, not the whole program. I didn't need to show myself playing a whole round of blackjack. Just one functionality. The input and the output. The input was the click, and the output was the hand being generated. Okay? The written response describes the overall purpose of the program. The overall purpose of the program is to play blackjack. Okay? That is not what I showed in my video. That is the overall purpose of the program. Okay? What I did show was the functionality that I demonstrated, right? So the functionality that I demonstrated was when you press the deal button, it generates a player hand with 2 cards and a dealer hand with 2 cards. All right? Describes the input and the output of the program demonstrated in the video. Input is clicking the deal button. The output is 2 lists being generated, player hand being shown as well as the total value of the player's hand, and the dealer's hand showing 1 card only. Those are my outputs. It says, do not award the point if the following is true. The video does not show demonstration of the program running. That's the only way that you can lose points here, is if you either don't show a video or you don't include these things. Right? So almost everybody should get this point. Now, it's worth noting, it's very important here, there are only 6 points available on this entire project. That means that if you miss 1 point, that's what, 16.5% off for missing just one of the boxes? So you need to make sure all the boxes matter. It's not like, oh, well, I'll get the rest of them. All of the boxes matter. You should get 100% on this. All right? Row 2. It says, the written response includes 2 program code segments. One that shows how data is being stored in the list, and the other one shows the same list being used as part of fulfilling the program's purpose. Right? What's the program's purpose? We said it was to play blackjack. So I need to show how using this lets me play blackjack. Okay? So the first one says the first program code segment shows how data is being stored in a list. Here's data being stored in a list. Right? I've got the values of cards that are possible in a deck of playing cards. I've got ace, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, jack, queen, king. Okay? The second program code segment must show the data in the same list being processed, such as creating a new data from an existing data or accepting multiple elements in a list as part of fulfilling the program's purpose. So I've got this iteration, this for loop here, where it says go through until you've done it for the number of cards. You're going to generate a random number, and you're going to grab that value from this values list, and then you're going to append that card into the player's hand. Right? So basically, generate a random number between 0 and 12, and then you are going to take the corresponding card and put that into the player's hand. All right? It says, provide a written response that does all the following. Identifies the name of the list. The list is called values. Describes what data is contained in the list and what it represents in the program. So the values represents all the possible card values that you could have in a deck of playing cards. That's all I need to put for that. Explains how the selected list manages complexity in program by explaining why your program code could not be written or how it would be written differently if you didn't have the list. Okay? You did part 1, part 2, part 3, and part 4, but none of them were important. The only important thing is part 5, and I'll show you why in a second here. In part 5, it says basically justify why you needed this list, right? And if you look at the rubric says includes 2 program code segments, identifies the name of the variable representing blah, 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 describes what data is contained in the list. But then over here it says, do not award the point if the following is true. The use of the list is trivial and does not assist in fulfilling the program's purpose. How do you think the grader is going to decide if the use of the list was trivial? Based on your response. You justify why you couldn't have made this program without that list, right? The grader isn't going to second guess you. If you make a good argument as to why you need the list, you get the point. But if you make a garbage argument here, you will not get the point, right? So I said, since the cards are numbers and strings, you could have a card that's, a 4, or you could have a card that's a king, right? Having a list allows you to generate a random number, so you can generate a random number between 0 and, say, 13, or 0 and 12, I guess, and then you can have it output either a number, if it's a value, or a letter, okay? It says if you didn't have this option, then you would need a bunch of if statements to say if the value is equal to 1, then change it to A. If the value is 11, then change it to J, so on and so forth, right? So could you have done this without a list? Sure. Would it have been more complex to do it without a list? Yes. So it says it manages the complexity. Not that you couldn't have done it without a list, but doing it without a list would be more complex, would be harder to do. All right? Why do I say 5 is important? Not only because you can't get this point, row 2, if you don't have a good answer of 5, but row 3 is entirely all about 5, right? It says, explains how the named selected list manages complexity in the program code by explaining why the program code could not be written or how it would be written differently without using the list. So 2 whole points out of 6 have to do with this response. Part 5 of 3B, right? So what I'm saying to you is you should probably go back and read through your part 5 of 3B to make sure that you have a absolutely rock star explanation here as to why your code wouldn't work without the list that you used. Okay? All right. 3C says that you are going to get a program code segment, right? Capture and paste 2 program code segments that you developed. The first program code segment must be student developed that defines a procedure by name and return type, contains the uses one or more parameters, right? Parameters are the ones that are in parentheses here, and implements sequencing, selection, and iteration, right? So parameters are the things that are in parentheses. Sequencing, everybody has this. Sequencing is just 2 or more lines of code in a row, right? Things that have to happen in a certain sequence. Selection, that's going to be an if statement, and iteration is going to be a for loop. You can very easily look through your program code segment and say, hey, do I have a parameter? Do I have an if statement? And do I have a for loop? If you can't say yes to all those, then you will not earn this point. We just look through and say, okay, this function, first of all, it starts with the word function, which I told you that all of yours should start with the word function. If it starts with the word on event, you did it wrong. Okay? And it says deal hand number of cards person. So I've got one parameter, two parameters. I've also got an if statement here and an else if here. So those are my selections. And then I've got iteration. You can see I've got a for loop here and I've got a for loop here. So I've got all the different parts that I need in this. And if I go over the rubric says includes two program code segments, one showing a student developed procedure with at least one parameter. So this one is, you can only get row 4 if it has a parameter. And then one showing where the procedure is being called, right? So again, in this part, I've got my parameter. That's what gives me the point there. And then where my procedure is called, you can see now I have an on event here where I call deal hand twice, right? I call deal hand to dealer, deal hand to player, right? Describes what the identified procedure does and how it contributes to the overall functionality of the program. All right, here we go. Here's another important part that you guys might have messed up. I've got my answer divided into two different parts. The first part says deal hand generates a list of cards that will belong to either the dealer or the player based on the person parameter. The number of cards parameters determines how many cards go into that list for each person. Okay? That is describing what the selected procedure does. Okay? Second part says in order to play blackjack, you need to score 21 points without going over, or you have to have more points than the dealer without going over 21. The hand that is generated gives you your initial points for the blackjack game. Okay? I need to tie this part about how it contributes to the overall functionality of the program. I need to tie that all the way back up to here when I said what the purpose of my program was. The purpose of my program is to play blackjack. How does the student-developed procedure contribute to me being able to play blackjack? Right? So not only what does the function do, but also how does it let you play blackjack, or how does it let you do the thing that your program is supposed to do? Right? Now, why do I say it needs this? Because if we look over here on the right side, it says do not award the point if the code segment consisting of the procedure is not included in the written responses section. That means you didn't paste the right code segment in. The procedure is built in or existing, such as an event handler or main method, where the student only implements the body of the procedure rather than defining the name, return type, and parameters. This is if you use an on event. If you use an on event, that is a built-in procedure. Therefore, you will not get points for it. All right, you can use an on event for the second part, which is your call. This part, show where it's called, but you cannot use an on event for this part here. All right. The last part says the written response describes what the procedure does independently without relating it to the overall function of the program. So if I had this part where I've brilliantly described what my procedure does, but I didn't include this part, I do not earn the point. I have to not only say what it does, but I have to say how it relates to the overall functionality of the program that I said earlier, which was to play blackjack in my case. Okay? The next thing says the written response includes program code segment that includes sequencing, selection, and iteration. So again, sequencing, that is 2 or more lines of code in a row. I certainly have that. Selection is an if statement. Boom. Iteration is a loop, so for loop. All right, got those. Explains in detailed steps how the identified algorithm works in enough detail that someone else could recreate it. What you should do here is go through and try to read each line of code and then explain what that line of code does, right? So in mine, I said Deal hand has two parameters, number of cards and person. If person is the player, then it will clear the current player's hand. All right, so it says, if person is player, it will clear the current player's hand. Then it will clear the current player. Then it will generate a random number between 0 and the length of the values list, and it will append the player's hand with a corresponding value from the values list. Okay, so what do we do here? We generate a random number between 0 and the length of the values list, and then it appends the player's hand with that card. Okay? Then, down here I say if the person is dealer, then it will clear the current dealer's hand, then generate a random number between 0 and the values list, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so all I've done is I've literally just gone through my function line by line and said what each part does. So this part clears the current player's hand, then it goes through the number of cards, and it generates a random value and then appends that value. Okay. The purpose of this, the whole point of this, is that it says someone should be able to recreate it, right? And the best way for somebody to be able to recreate what my function does is for me to go through it line by line and just say what each part does, right? All right. Do not award a point if any of the following are true. The response only describes what the selected algorithm does without explaining how it does it. Ooh. Maybe I need to add some stuff here to mine. So the response only describes what the algorithm does without explaining how it does it. So maybe here I should say deal hand has two parameters. If person blah, 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 generates a random number between 0 and the length of the values list. How about using the built-in random number function? Then it will append the player's hand with the corresponding value from the values list using the built-in append item function. It repeats this process with a for loop until the hand contains the number of cards specified by the number of cards parameter. Cool. So now I'm going to go and grab this, and I'm going to replace this here. So I could have lost that point because I didn't specify how it does it, only that it did do it, right? So now I want to generate, if the value is dealer, then it clears the current dealer's hand and generates a random number and appends the dealer's hand. What's up?
So it should say what it does and how it does it?
Yes. So this part, again, we've got response. We lose the point if the response only describes what the selected algorithm does without explaining how it does it. So we need to explain how it does it, right? Using for loops, using the append item. The description of the algorithm does not match the included program code, so you were talking about a different thing. I don't think that's going to be a problem for most of you. The code segment consisting of the selected algorithm is not included in the written response. Again, you got to make sure that you copy the right code segment in. The algorithm is not explicitly identified. So if instead of pasting in, and I saw a lot of you guys doing this yesterday, so I think some of you might need to go back and change some things. Instead of having this section here, you had a much larger section of your code in there. So you would have like, you know, this. You put this whole thing in there. Now, does this contain the part of code that you need, which is deal hand? Yes, but it's got too much other stuff, right? You might be tempted. You're like, oh, well, if you have deal hand, you need to know what values are, and you need to know what player hand is and dealer hand is, but you don't. You shouldn't, right? So you need to make sure that you only have the part that starts with the word function, and that's it. All right, so function, deal hand. The use of either the selection or iteration is trivial and does not affect the outcome of the program, right? So if you were like, oh, shoot, my function doesn't have iteration in it, so I'm going to go ahead and just add a for loop that like counts to 10, but doesn't do anything, well, that doesn't count, right? You need to have a for loop that does something. All right. This next part is for, it's the last point, and it is for 4C. Again, we've talked about this already in here, but I still saw a fair amount of issues with it, okay? It says 4C, but it's actually 3D. So all these letters on the side here are wrong, even though this is the official College Board document. They don't actually correspond to the numbers on here anymore. Okay. Describe two calls. So again, we got describe two calls. So you've got a difference between putting something like this, deal cards player 2. Okay, this is your actual call for this, or deal hand, I forget what it's called, deal hand. Okay, this is the actual call, but this is what it wants you to say. In my first call, I would pass in player as the person and 2 as the number of cards, right? Not this. This is code. This is the description of what you did. Okay, so your first call passes in player and 2 as the number of cards. Second call, I would pass in dealer as the person and 2 as the number of cards. Okay, both of them has 2 as the number of cards. You have player and dealer as your person parameter. Conditions tested. So if I look at my function here, here's person. And if I pass in person equals player, it will check this and it will check this, right? If I pass in person equals dealer, it will check this and it will check this. So what conditions are being tested? In both cases, it will test if the person is equal to player or if the person is equal to dealer, right? These are both the same thing, right? Now, if I wanted to get fancy, technically speaking, this one would not check to see if it was equal to dealer. So I might say something like test if the person is equal to player. Since it is, it will not test if person is equal to dealer, because I have a else if statement. So I know that this else if here will not happen if this is true. But in the second time, for the second call, it tests if the person is equal to player or if the person is equal to dealer. And I might want to put in here if or if the person is equal to dealer in a separate if statement, right? Because this sounds like you're using the or, like the bars, these guys, but we're not. Okay, identifies the result of each call. The result of the first call is the number of cards specified by number of cards parameter will be added to the player's hand. Okay, the results of the second call is the number of cards specified and the number of cards parameters will be added to the dealer's hand. All right, very important here. If we look at the code, you can see that if I have person equals player, it will execute this block of code. If I have person equals dealer, it will execute this block of code, right? So 2 different blocks of code based on the argument that I passed in, whether it was player or dealer. This is important because it says in here, it says describe 2 calls to the selected procedure identified in response 3C. So again, another issue that I saw on a few people's things that they submitted yesterday, you have to use the same function in 3D that you were talking about in 3C. You can't pick a different function, okay? Describe the conditions being tested by each call to the procedure. So again, I described the conditions being tested. Again, they were very similar. They were checking to see if it would pass in, or if it would test if it was equal to player, or if it was equal to player or dealer. And then the last one says, identifies the result of each call. But it says the procedure is not identified, or does not have a parameter. So again, we need to have a parameter that we can pass in. The response for 3D does not apply to the procedure in 3C. I don't think that's going to be a problem. The two calls cause the same segment of code in the algorithm to execute, even if the result is different. Okay? So they must execute two different blocks of code. Okay? What if I did this? What if I said for my first one, I'll pass in player as the person and 2 is the number of cards. And this one I'll do player as the person and 5 as the number of cards. Well, if I look at my code, this one, player is the person, and it executes this, and it will add 2 cards to their hand. The next argument would add 5 cards to their hand. That does not qualify on the rubric. Even though it did 2 different things, my block of code that was executed was the same block of code. It needs to execute 2 different blocks of code. The 2 calls cause the same segment of code in the algorithm to execute, even if the results are different. So again, my results would have been different in that case because one would generate 5 cards and one would generate 2. But in this case, it wouldn't qualify because they execute the same segments of code, right? This one, the last part that I can miss, says the response describes conditions being tested that are implausible, inaccurate, or inconsistent. And this one is that the results are implausible, accurate, or inconsistent. I don't see these being a big deal, but this is the problem. Again, I want you to know that you have until May 20th to press the submit final button. That's a really long time from now. I highly recommend that you look through your stuff here. This is a very large chunk of your exam grade, your exam grade for this course, right? It's only 6 points, corresponding to 6 rows on a rubric, and each row of the rubric is very clear as to how you get it and how you don't get it. There's no reason to not score all these points. There's no reason that you should miss points on this portion. It's all there for you. It's like cheating. It's like taking a test with the key right next to you. Don't put answers that are wrong when the right answers are right here. Right? Sometimes you might have to change your code. If you look in your function, and your function doesn't have one of those things, it doesn't have, a parameter, or it doesn't have an if statement, or it doesn't have a for loop, you need to figure out a way to get that into your code and then have it do something. Because like I said, you can't just have it count to 10 in a for loop if that doesn't do anything, because that would mean that it's trivial. Make sense? You can submit as many times as you want to College Board on that digital portfolio. You don't need to resubmit to Canvas. Just change it on College Board. When you feel comfortable and ready, you can press submit final, but know that when you press submit final, you cannot unsubmit and you cannot change anything.